She knocked with banana bread. He answered with music through the wall. One had a wooden arm. The other, a cracked heart. Neither was looking for love. But silence brought them closer than words ever could. The elevator groaned as it rose to the 28th floor, the highest in the building. Amira Blake shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clutching a box of sketchbooks and a chipped mug that read, "Whisk it real good." Her curls were pinned up beneath a scarf, and her shoulders ached from the move. But she smiled. This was a new beginning. Apartment 28B wasn't perfect. It was a bit too close to the stairwell, and the hallway lights flickered like they hadn't been fixed since the Obama years, but it was hers. After 3 years of couch surfing and late-night food deliveries to survive, Amira had finally landed a lease. In Manhattan, no less. The doorman, an older Dominican man named Raphael, had squinted at her earlier when she signed the papers. "You sure you want this floor, Mija?" he asked, half whispering. She thought it was about the rent. "I've seen worse," she shrugged. But Raphael didn't laugh. He just said, "Ain't nobody lived next door since the accident." She didn't ask. She was too tired to chase ghosts. Later that night, Amira sat cross-legged in the middle of her tiny living room, eating leftover gumbo out of a Tupperware. She had a playlist going, old jazz and a few lo-fi beats. But around 11 p.m., she paused the music. Because she heard it. Faint, deliberate, and impossibly elegant, the sound of a piano drifting through the walls. A Chopin nocturne, if her memory from culinary school's art appreciation class served her right. But it wasn't playing from her speakers, and it wasn't on her phone. It was coming from next door. She stood up, frozen for a moment. Her apartment shared only one wall, with apartment 28A, the penthouse. The one Raphael said had been empty for years. Amira walked to the wall and pressed her ear against the cool plaster. The notes were clear, rich, and not recorded. Someone was playing. Right now. Not clumsy like a hobbyist. This was someone who had studied. Someone who had lived in sound. She whispered, as if afraid to interrupt. "Hello?" Of course, there was no answer. But when the music stopped, she felt it. A silence that wasn't just quiet. It was listening back. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of apartment 28B. Amira stretched, groggy but still haunted by the music from last night. She hadn't dreamed it. The keys had been too precise, too alive. And yet, no one should have been next door. Her stomach growled. She wandered into the kitchen, barely more than a corner with a sink and a 2-burner stove, and dug into her last bag of flour. She didn't have much, but when life felt out of her control, baking was the one thing she could rely on. An old habit from culinary school. By noon, the apartment was filled with the smell of banana bread, rich, nutty, warm. She added cinnamon, chopped walnuts, and just a hint of orange zest. As she placed the loaf on the counter to cool, she paused. The wall again. That same wall between her kitchen and apartment 28A. She looked at the loaf. She looked at the wall. Then she did something impulsive. Amira wrapped 2 thick slices in parchment paper, scribbled a note, still warm, made with cinnamon and curiosity, and placed it outside apartment 28A, knocking once. Then she ran back to her unit like a kid who just dared the universe. No one opened the door. Not then. Not the rest of the day. That night, as she lay reading in bed, she heard it again. Music. Not the polished perfection from last night. This time, it was hesitant. Like someone searching. A few wrong notes. A pause. Then a restart. Then something tender, a variation on the nocturne from before, played slower, softer, as if answering her. She smiled into the darkness. The next morning, she found something under her door. A folded piece of parchment. Plain. Unmarked. Inside. A simple sentence, handwritten in clean block letters. "You used too much orange zest." But the warmth made it forgivable. Amira blinked. Then laughed. For the first time in months, someone had tasted her food and said something real. Something not on a rating site, not from a customer with a complaint. Just a sentence. A shared moment. And suddenly, the wall didn't feel so lonely. It started with a question at the mailbox. Amira had gone down to retrieve a package of sketch supplies when she noticed the older woman from 28C fumbling with her keys. Ms. Margot. Always wore lavender and pearls. Always said, "Darling, too much." Amira cleared her throat. "Hi, Ms. Margot. Can I ask you something?" The woman looked up, smiling. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Amira hesitated. "The penthouse. Next door to me. Do you know who lives there?" Ms. Margot's smile didn't disappear, but it shifted, subtle, almost sad. Oh, him. Julian West. Brilliant mind, that one. Tech genius. Used to be on every magazine cover. Then, something happened. Amira listened, heart steady. There was an accident a few years ago, Margot continued softly. No one really knows the details. He disappeared after that. They say he lost an arm, but what he really lost was his desire to be seen. Amira stood silent. Margot added, but I still hear his music sometimes. Late at night. It's how I know he's still somewhere in there. That night, Amira made chocolate lava cakes. Not because she had the ingredients, she barely had enough cocoa, but because something in her wanted to say, I see you. Even if you don't see yourself yet. She placed one small cake in a box, tied it with twine, and slid a note under his door. If music is your language, let baking be mine. Want to try making something together? The next morning, no reply. The next day, silence. The third day, another note returned. I only have one hand. Just that. No name. No signature. Amira stared at it. Then wrote back, same paper. Then you'll just have to teach me how to stir with one. Deal. She added a slice of lemon pound cake for courage. The reply came folded carefully in thirds. If I burn the kitchen, it's your fault. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. Amira smiled as she pulled her apron from the back of her pantry. There were worse ways to begin a friendship than with flour and hope. And for the first time in years, behind the silent door of 28A, Julian West reached for it. The storm hit just after midnight. A heavy wind curled through the city, tugging at trees and shaking windows. Somewhere below, a transformer popped with a flash, and just like that, the building went dark. Amira was halfway through icing a batch of vanilla cupcakes when it happened. One moment, she was humming to herself. The next, silence. No fridge hum. No hallway lights. No glow from the oven. Then, the worst part, her hands began to tremble. She hated the dark. Not just in the way everyone did, but in the way a child once locked in a closet for 3 hours learns to fear it. The panic didn't come in waves. It came like a chokehold. She backed into the wall, dropping the frosting spatula. Breathe, Amira. You're not 6 anymore. But her lungs didn't listen. She reached for her phone, dead. Charger unplugged. Flashlight? Somewhere. Too far. The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick with unseen walls. Then, a flicker under the front door. Light. She stumbled toward it, and without thinking, opened her door and crossed the hallway. 1 knock. 2. Then silence. The door creaked open. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, a tall figure in the dark, holding an oil lamp. The flame danced between them, casting shadows. Amira tried to speak, but her voice cracked. I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to. Julian tilted his head. You're afraid of the dark. Not a question. A fact. Amira nodded. It's stupid. He handed her the lamp. It's not stupid. She stepped inside. The penthouse was not what she expected. It wasn't a sterile billionaire's lair. It was warm, cozy, in a strange, lonely way. Books stacked against walls. An unfinished canvas in the corner. A piano with worn keys and a single wooden chair beside it. Julian watched her. His left sleeve hung loose, no arm beneath it. His right hand clutched a worn cloth towel, as if caught mid-cleaning. Amira didn't stare. She didn't flinch. She just whispered, It smells like cedar and cookies in here. Julian half smiled. The cedar is real. The cookies are wishful thinking. They sat in the kitchen, lamp between them. Neither said much. But Amira's hands had stopped shaking, and Julian, for once, didn't feel the need to disappear. After a long silence, she finally said, You don't look like a recluse. He looked at her. And you don't sound like someone afraid of the dark. She smiled. You haven't heard me cry in the closet yet. Julian looked down. I don't have a closet. Just a very large room. I haven't left in 3 years. A moment passed. Then Amira leaned forward, brushing flour off her apron. Come over tomorrow. I'll teach you how to make real cookies. You bring the music. I'll bring the cinnamon. Julian hesitated, then nodded. A soft yes. Barely above the storm. But for them, it was louder than thunder. Julian stood outside apartment 28B, holding a bag of apples and a wooden spoon. His right hand clenched slightly around the handle as if steadying not just the spoon, but himself. He had replayed her words all night in his head. You bring the music. I'll bring the cinnamon. He hadn't baked since college, long before algorithms, headlines, and prosthetics. But something about Amira's kitchen, the smell of vanilla and laughter, felt like a world he might want to belong to. When the door opened, Amira's face lit up. You came. He hesitated. You invited me. She stepped aside with a grin. Welcome to my two-burner kingdom. Amira's kitchen was tiny, but filled with sunlight. There was flour on the counter, measuring spoons scattered like musical notes. Julian stared at the chalkboard above the stove that read, "Today's secret ingredient is trust." She caught his gaze. It changes every morning. Trust is bold, he murmured. Flour was yesterday. Boring. They got to work. Amira moved with practiced ease, measuring sugar, cracking eggs one-handed to tease him. Julian fumbled but learned fast. She showed him how to use the side of a whisk with a wooden arm. It took patience, but he managed. You've got rhythm, she said. I cheat. I count in threes, like waltzes. She chuckled. Then let's dance. The moment came without warning. Amira leaned over to check the dough texture, and Julian, trying to pass her a bowl, froze. There was flour dusted across her cheek, just below her eye. He reached forward, and with the side of his wooden thumb, gently wiped it away. She blinked. Their eyes locked. Julian didn't smile, but his voice came quiet, grounded. Can we be friends? Amira's breath hitched. The moment stretched. She could have laughed, teased, deflected, but instead, she said, only if you mean it. I do. A beat. I just might mean more, someday. Later, as cookies baked, they sat cross-legged on the floor with mugs of tea. Amira asked, what changed your mind? Julian looked at the oven light. You. Then, you didn't flinch. At your hand. At me. The next week, things began to shift. Julian came over twice more. Then 3. Then it became habit. They made muffins, then bread, then complicated things with names he couldn't pronounce. Amira's freelance work exploded. Her illustrations for cookbooks got picked up by a publisher. One morning, she opened her inbox and burst into tears. Julian showed up that night with a pint of ice cream and said, we're celebrating. No objections. They started walking outside. At first, Julian wore his longest coat, hiding the wooden limb. But Amira would loop her arm through his gently and say, they'll stare if you hide it. They'll forget if you don't. By the end of spring, he walked in short sleeves. Once, in Central Park, a child pointed and asked, is that your robot arm? Julian knelt down and said, nah, it's better. It's my baking arm. The child giggled. Amira grinned. Julian stood taller after that. One afternoon, they were sitting on a bench near the river. Amira held a sketch pad, Julian a book. Neither spoke for a while. Then Julian said, do you ever wonder how you got here? Amira smiled. Every day. And I think. I opened the right door. He turned to her. His eyes softer. So did I. He still played piano. But now, he didn't stop when she listened. And when he played, she'd hum along, dancing in the kitchen, her laughter filling every empty note. Julian no longer saw a missing limb when he looked in the mirror. He saw the flour dust on his collar, the freckles of cinnamon on the counter, and a girl with curls and confidence waiting to mix the next bowl. And every time he reached for something, a whisk, a word, a life, he knew there'd be another hand waiting to meet his halfway. A future made of flour, music, and a door finally left open. The invitation was simple, handwritten on parchment, sealed with a cinnamon stick. Come for music. Stay for cookies. 28A and 28B. They pinned it on the bulletin board in the lobby. Just one. No RSVP required. Julian had never hosted anyone. Not since he built this place, long before the silence. But now, the penthouse was full of life, cookie trays stacked on counters, notes of lemon and ginger in the air, and Amira singing off-key as she dusted powdered sugar on everything she could reach. He still wasn't used to crowds. His heartbeat was steady but loud, like a cautious drum in his chest. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt short sleeves. No hiding the wooden arm. Amira came up behind him, looping her arms around his waist. You look amazing, she whispered. He looked at her reflection. I look unfinished. She shook her head. You look like a man who stopped waiting behind a wall. The guests began to arrive just after 6. Neighbors, the grocer from downstairs, 2 kids who once giggled at Julian's baking arm. Everyone brought something: wine, stories, flowers, and secondhand jars. Julian stood near the piano. He hadn't played in front of people in years. Want me to stall them? Amira teased, holding a tray of snickerdoodles. He took a breath. No. I want to remember what it feels like. He sat down, flexed his fingers, one real, one imagined. Then he began. Not Chopin this time. Not sad, not polished. He played something new. Something Amira had hummed while folding dough 2 nights ago. Soft, imperfect, alive. Amira leaned against the wall, eyes closed, smiling. Around her, people stopped talking. The cookies waited. The music didn't. When the final note faded, the room stayed still. Then came the applause. Gentle, real. Julian stood up and looked directly at them, not down, not away. "Thank you for coming back to me," he said. No one understood fully, but Amira did. She took his hand, wooden fingers and all, and raised it like a violinist after a concert. Later, after most had gone, they stood on the balcony. The city glowed below, quiet and soft. Amira leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think you finally opened the door." Julian smiled. "You knocked first." They didn't talk about forever. They didn't have to. In the penthouse that once held only silence, now there was music. And in the kitchen that once had only memory, now there was flour on the counter, and 2 mugs, always waiting, always warm.